C's are unacceptable, McKella.
C's get degrees.
We don't want to be average.
Let's see as bad as
We want to be exceptional. Darby, from here on out, every essay assignment is just going to be a C. It's going to be like, hey, you know what?
I really need happy.
Okay. So you get that 0.4 kind of added. Well, next time you're making this argument about, well, being average is a good thing, you can use some eloquence to kind of heighten your argument overall, and then that
it's
will sound
really
pretty
good then.
That's not exactly very eloquent, but this is also a good way to maybe, if you find that your speeches are running a little short, this is a way to like emphasize some things and repeat, so they might kind of add a little substance that way too. No reason why I'm making eye contact with it right now. It's just totally written. Okay, no problem. All right, so what we're taking a look at is eloquence, establishing elements of persuasion. This is different from the logical fallacies because with logical fallacies we're going, all right, stay away from doing this, or if you are going to use a logical fallacy, certainly be aware of the consequences that could happen. For eloquence, what we're taking a look at is trying to utilize these things. Now, it's certainly going to be something where within moderation, where you don't want your argument in your mind to be effective solely because of the eloquence that is getting used. You need to have content with it, certainly in order for the eloquence to have any kind of effect. But the two main reasons why folks are going to use eloquence is, it kind of moves people emotionally more so than plain language without doing the whole faulty emotional appeal thing. But people, they like hearing things, whether it be something like alliteration or some metaphors and things along those lines, where it can kind of help them understand the idea better. So in that way, it could move them to your side more so than just kind of simply saying, C is average, C is good, plus it's CHS, yay, it's all good kind of thing. The other big thing, and this would be really significant, especially when you compare it to an article analysis or English class essays for the Scarlet Letter and the Crucible and all that kind of stuff. When you write something down and a person reads it, there's a record of it, you can go back to it. When you are speaking, you only remember what you hear. You can't go back and take a look at it and have it jog your memory. So one of the more common types of eloquence that really gets utilized, and those of you who were in AP last year, you'll remember a lot of these. Those of you who are in AP this year, you'll be seeing them a lot more, are going to be different types of like syntactical things you do with repetition to help emphasize some points. So Mikhail's giving her speech. We don't have a transcript of it, but if she emphasizes some things through some repetition that are done in a tactful manner, it can be pretty effective and help the audience remember it a little bit better. The good news is a lot of this stuff you probably already do. It's not that it's the good news is you already naturally kind of do a lot of these things. The one slide is missing, don't know where it went, so I'll let you know about it. We're going to break these down into two categories. There are schemes, S-C-H-E-M-E, you want to write this term down, scheme, S-C-H-E-M-E, and tropes. Don't write down tropes yet, we'll get to those later. Schemes are types of eloquence where you are focusing on the arrangement of words. So you are focusing on the arrangement of words. You are manipulating the arrangement of words to help your ideas come across better. The English class term for this is you're focusing on syntax, sentence structure. But schemes, you're taking a look at the arrangement of words. Tropes is going to be more figurative language. We'll get to those things a little bit later. So the first group of things that we're going to be taking a look at, all of these would classify as schemes. Many of them you've already heard before, such as alliteration. I'm going to give you a warning right off the bat. There are a ton of A terms. So those are probably the ones you're going to have to kind of pay attention to a little bit. Alliteration, antimetabole, anaphora, antidiphlosis, all those kinds of things going over and over and over again. All right. All right, so alliteration, repetition, I think you've heard this one before, of initial or medium consonants in two or more adjacent words. So, we got a little example here from Wizard of Oz. Anyone ever dress up as Dorothy, Halloween, or Tin Man? You could be Tin Man. You're lying. What's the third one? Scarecrow. Yeah, then I'm just going Scarecrow. Who would be the best? No. Who would be the best Dorothy? But Dorothy's nice. Like she would share stuff.
Oh, thank you. But then it's not, yeah.
I knew that was going to be the next comment.
I offered Jordan a sip of my coffee. She doesn't like coffee.
You offered her like a sip of your germs.
She offered me a bite of her Uncrustable. I'm not
Exactly.
sharing my bag. She doesn't like coffee. I know that about her because we're friends. I remember.
Don't probably forget my
You think Matt could be like all powerful Emerald City guy?
Isn't he like an idiot? I'm a
Hey,
fan of
I was just alluding to some things. I wasn't going to be explicit about it the way that you were.
Okay,
I
I think
think
Matt should be the
Very
very
smart.
smart.
We'll save that for another day.
Yeah, I'll be like the bad witch. What is
I do like this song.
it? Yeah,
You clinking, clanking, clattering collection of collisionous junk!
There's Matt. Actually looked like Sheldon a little bit from Big Bang Theory. So, alliteration, and again, this is a nice kind of simple one where you're simply, by emphasizing the sound, you're emphasizing the terms. Now, if you were to have a sentence where you use the words, was and where, you're probably not really using alliteration. The key thing when it comes to any of these terms is you're emphasizing key points that you're trying to get across. So if we were, describe Maria, in as few words as you possibly could, or like within a sentence or whatnot, if you say something like, oh, she's a good student, she's very nice and personable, Griff's nodding his head yes, there's a slight smirk on his face, very hard to pick up. Whereas if you go, well, she's very dynamic and diligent and disciplined, the use of emphasizing that D sound over and over and over again has those words kind of resonate with you a little bit longer. He did not seem to agree with those terms quite as much as the others did.
We're gonna be sitting next to
I don't know
each
why.
other.
All right, repetition, one of our A terms. There's going to be a lot of different kinds of repetition that are showing up. So my screen's blank, but you have stuff behind on that screen. That's interesting. Anaphora, you also hear the term anaphora for pronunciation. Both of them are accepted. So if someone does say anaphora, you don't have to go, wait a minute, that's not how you say it. Both pronunciations, people do recognize. Repetition, not of the sound, but of the same word or group of words at the beginning of successive clauses, and those could be, whether they be clauses or sentences. Either one would work. But you are doing a repetition at the beginning of a sentence. Could be something as simple as one word, could be, 3, 4 words if you have a phrase. So in this case, Martin Luther King Jr. Speech in 1965, let us march to the realization of the American dream. Let us march on segregated housing. Let us march on segregated schools. Let us march on poverty. Let us march on ballot boxes. Notice that he's also using alliteration in places when it comes to segregated schools, ballot boxes, to kind of emphasize those points. So we have anaphora where there's the repetition at the beginning. We are going to have a term that's also, of course, if we have repetition at the beginning, you also have repetition at the end of sentences can happen as well. Usually you use anaphora when you are talking about something that you want to have accomplished. It doesn't always have to be future like this one with lettuce, but a lot of times folks will use it as a way to kind of gain momentum to accomplish something. And then the other ones where they do repetition at the end of the sentences, that is when you're kind of taking a look at something that has already occurred, something that has happened. All right? So it could be as simple as one word, could be a short phrase like this. As long as I would say for most of these you have it happening 3 times, that's going to count as like an anaphora.
One very effective public speaking or presentation technique is called anaphora, which means simply the repetition of a key word or phrase at the beginning of successive sentences. It's a great way of emphasizing a point, and Barack Obama used it often during his inauguration speech in January 2009.
The God-given promise that all are equal, all are free, and all deserve a chance to pursue their full measure of happiness. For us, they packed up their few worldly possessions and traveled across oceans in search of a new life. For us, they toiled in sweatshops and settled the West, endured the lash of the whip, and plowed the hard earth. For us, they fought and died in places like Concord and Gettysburg, Normandy, and Quai San. This is the price and the promise of citizenship. This is the source of our confidence, the knowledge that God calls on us to shape an uncertain destiny. This is the meaning of our liberty and our creed, why men and women and children of every race and every faith can join in celebration across this magnificent mall.
So that last one, you just have the word "this" getting repeated. It can be as simple as just that one phrase, that one term, that one word, calling emphasis to what you're looking at. So it doesn't have to be entire phrases. Mentioned, okay, we have repetition at the beginning, therefore you're going to have repetition at the end. Repetition at the end is going to be epistrophe. So same concept as anaphora, but rather than putting it at the front of the sentence or the clause, you're going to have it at the end. And this is usually where you're taking a look at things that have already occurred in past tense. So Malcolm X in speech, as long as you were sent to Korea, Germany, and the South Pacific, you bled. As long as the white man sent you to Korea, you bled. He sent you to Germany, you bled. Sent you to the South Pacific to fight the Japanese, you bled. So emphasis is now being placed at the end of the sentence as opposed to the beginning. Anaphora, epistrophe, I told you there's a bunch of A terms, but maybe when you know that anaphora and epistrophe are the two types of repetition, think A, beginning of the alphabet, beginning of the sentence. Epistrophe begins with E, end of the sentence, where that repetition would be happening. Same thing, could be one word, could be phrase. It's not like there's a designated set number of words that it has to be. Another simple example, Gettysburg Address, that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. So you just have it happening with one word. All right, now repetition, another A term. Darby, how do you say this word? It's fun watching people struggle. It's okay. Matt had this word last year, and he still probably forgets. Pretty well with that. Antimetabolism. Remember the fun times of literary term quizzes? You just loved those Wednesdays.
I did.
It's about a month away. They'll show up soon.
Oh, they're coming back.
Well, not for you.
Oh,
Darby will have some. Noel will have some. Maybe you'll have some. I don't know. So antimetabole, it's the repetition of the words, the whole phrase in successive clauses, but it is in reverse grammatical order. Okay, so I'll show you an example. It reflects this one. How about that? John F. Kennedy speech. Anyone want to take a guess?
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
So you're taking the same phrase and you are just reversing the grammatical order of it. Who likes food? It's okay, man. You don't have to say it. I don't know why you wouldn't. That's okay. Well, do you live to eat, or do you eat to live? I would eat. you do the same thing, with work and stuff like that. So it's you're taking a phrase, you're putting it in reverse grammatical order, kind of emphasize maybe the contradiction or the issue that would be taken there with it. Shortly after 9/11, President Bush tonight were awakened to danger and called to defend freedom. Whether we bring our enemies to justice or justice to our enemies, justice will be done. So again, you have parallel phrase, but just switch the grammatical order of it. So that reversal kind of causes emphasis for that little conflict that could be taking place with it. Another form of repetition, it looks like a dinosaur or sounds like a dinosaur name, anadiplosis, but it's not. Repetition of the last word of one clause, and then you put it at the beginning of the following clause. So you end a clause or sentence with a word, and then you begin the very next sentence with that same word. This one can be tricky because it can, if it's done poorly, you can just sound really redundant and repetitive. I read a book by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald was an author during, the 1920s. It can kind of sound a little choppy if you just have the same word kind of repeating over and over again. This one I would say would be a little bit trickier to do. If you do, though, have a succession of clauses where you want to link together the relationship of those ideas, that's when anadiplosis can be pretty effective. But repetition of the last word of one clause, and then you start the very next sentence with that same trick. This is a very dramatic presentation for anadiplosis. Just listen to that music, man. That's going to suck you in. I didn't do this. Wow, much better. Get ready, Griff.
Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering.
All you need is love. All you need is love. All you need is love. Love. Love is all you need.
So, probably the one that we have with Yoda is fun because he just goes. But you are getting the relationship, how, like a domino effect of one term kind of leads into the next one. So you have that repetition. Russell Crowe, Gladiator. I don't want that movie anymore. That's like 15 years old. It's older than that, probably. Before you, probably born now, Matt. I wasn't old. I was in college. Might be like 2000 or so. When were you born? Oh, you're still a child of that century. That's good to know. There's a part where when Russell Crowe and Joaquin Phoenix, the Caesar of the time, they're about to do their last battle, and Russell Crowe's like kind of locked up and goes. The line is along the lines of a general who became a slave who became a gladiator who challenged the emperor. You're getting that repetition of those words at the end of one clause leading on to the next. So if you have a lot of components that you're trying to highlight the relationship between or among, that would be a good way to go with it. Don't call it antithesis. Your English teacher or me will shove you in a locker and not open it, so stay away from it. I figured Matt would then throw out the term. Antithesis, the juxtaposition of contrasting ideas often written in parallel form. So you have contrasting ideas where you're trying to kind of emphasize the difference between those, but those contrasting ideas are written in parallel form. Example would be like the opening lines to A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. Would certainly probably be one of the more common examples with antithesis. Sound on this one's going to be a little tough because, that satellite connection between the moon and the U.S. Space Center wasn't so good in 1969. So one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Contrasting idea, how is it just a little step for man, but then a huge leap for mankind? When it's written in that parallel form, you still have that parallel structure that will be taking place. So antithesis, anadiplosis, antimetaboly, anaphora, alliteration, probably those A terms are the ones that you're going to have to kind of keep up with the most. And hey, why not throw one more term out there with assonance? Similar to alliteration, but you're taking a look at the repetition of vowel sounds. Not at the beginning of the word, but like that internal vowel sound. Rhyming words have assonance with them, but they don't have to specifically rhyme for assonance to be present. If you're using successive words that have a long E sound, even though they may not rhyme, you still have that assonance happening. Poetry is probably, and music, where you would see these, the most. So Edgar Allan Poe, The Silken Sad, uncertain, rustling of purple, curtain, uncertain, curtain, purple. That U sound, you're kind of getting that same sound, that repetition taking place. Mr. Heil, AP Lit folks. Poetry packets, T.S. Eliot loves using assonance all the time. What? You're doing T.S. Eliot poems, yeah? Good luck. You have T.S. Eliot plays later, too. T.S. Eliot's from St. Louis. T.S. Eliot's considered a British author. Go figure. He writes poems about beaches. One of the more famous lines from 1990s pop culture. Matt, this was before you were born. O.J. Simpson trial, if it doesn't fit, you must acquit. And then going back to 1990s, what's the line? Griff's like quoting it. I can't hear it. I think Max could be Maverick and you could be Goose. I didn't jump to that conclusion. I was just saying I think that could be Halloween coming up. If you don't want to, that's fine. I'm just throwing out ideas. Trying to help you out. Alright, climax. Arrangement of words, phrases, clauses in order of increasing importance. You could make the argument that the Yoda speech that we had before with the anadiplosis was also climax because it leads to a profound statement at the end, and that leads to suffering. But it's one of those instances where climactic phrases are not always going to be anadiplosis. So it's like that square rectangle kind of relationship. So this is one where we're taking a line from one of Shakespeare's sonnets, one of his poems. Beauty is but a vain and doubtful good, a shining gloss that fadeth suddenly, a flower that dies when it first begins to bud, when it first begins to bud. A brittle glass that's broken presently, a doubtful good, a glass of flower, lost, faded, broken, dead within an hour. So you build up all these phrases. They don't necessarily have to be in parallel form. They're usually pretty close. And then you end with your most significant kind of climactic conclusion that would be taking place. That beauty, though wonderful, is just a short-lived experience. Unless you're me. This has been beautiful for the last 37 years. Got another 37. Times 2. No, I hope that's not true. That would be too long. And then parallelism, bless you. One. You got one more. You two sneezer? Okay. Last one we're going to do for today, parallelism, similarity of structure in a pair or series of related words, phrases, clauses. So you certainly could have examples where you could argue, well, anaphora, epistrophe, all those things could be parallelism, but they don't always fit into one of those categories. So in this case, We mutually pledge for each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. You could argue parallelism, parallel structure would basically be the same thing. You could say that this one also is anaphora because of that repetition of our at the beginning. So sometimes words can kind of become a little bit, or phrases can be a little bit more specific, where anaphora would be a type of parallelism, but you could have examples where it would not necessarily fit into like an anaphora or epistrophe. Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe. That would not fit into an epistrophe, an anaphora, any of those kinds of types of repetition, but it would just be an overall parallel form. So tomorrow we'll start with tropes, where we'll be taking a look at changing meaning of words, so more metaphorical kind of figurative language stuff with that. And hey, we made it through a whole